Ready? Great, well, welcome. My name is Glenn Yago from the Milken Institute. We're very glad to have you here for a continuation of a discussion we started a couple of years ago at the height of what was referred to at the time of the Arab Spring. And we had a session at that year, that first conversation about the changing face of the Middle East, where we had a number of very interesting perspectives emerge. We had a discussion, just to bring you up to date on that, where we had Abdul Malik El-Jabbar from Amina Apps in Amman having a discussion with Shimon Peres from Patango, and what the potential was of a region that would merge up like the BRICS that would be called Turkey, Israel, and the Middle East, and a great promise of economic revival in one of the areas where economic growth has managed to not occur over the last 2 decades. And then interesting stories emerged from that panel as well, from Ranan Husseibeh from King's College and Zika Abzug from Cisco, where Zika was talking about, if some of you were here, just sort of what you missed last two conferences, was on the subject of what happened when there was looking at the R&D centers in Israel that were trying to outsource programming and figuring out that could be done much more cheaply from Ramallah than from India or China, and the types of relationships and the companies that emerged and the funds that emerged that generate now about 13% of the Palestinian Authority's GDP in terms of software development at companies like Amal and from Sadra and others. And Chris Schroeder from the Washington Post, who did this really exciting book, which we featured at one of our forums at the Milken Institutes on Startups Rising, on the beginnings of entrepreneurship and economic development throughout what people had called the Middle East. And then that was last year's subject at a session we called 2-3 Mini Middle East, that there were more. What's characteristic about the discussions we've had is that we keep trying to disaggregate and demystify the Middle East. This is a pinnacle of this discussion and conversation today, where we try to see why are we even talking about it with those terms. Let's start with defining our terms for a moment. The underlying question that we have is really, could the natural gas and oil alternative exports play a role in redefining the Middle East in the 21st century that would be similar to what happened in the coal and steel industry that created economic cooperation in Europe during the 20th century and ended centuries of war and destruction and displacement. As we spoke about the 2-3 Mini Middle East last year, as we talked about knowledge-based export capital, looking at startups that could decouple the non-oil producing parts of the Middle East, or what had up until recently been non-energy producing parts of the Middle East, from what had been the toxic impacts of oil politics of decades since the beginning of the 20th century. If we bring up slide number 7, we'll just look at what the oil versus the non-oil producing growth charts were. That's number 7, I believe I asked for there. And you can just see where the parts of the Middle East that are non-oil versus the oil-producing area, the Gulf states basically, which had a symbiotic relationship with the non-oil parts of the producing each, which created some really difficult politics for decades. But let's even start definitionally a little bit further back. Where do we call this? Why does this term Middle East actually exist? And if you pull up slide number 2, you'll see something, slide number 2, let's see, it's the one, that's not it. That's the one with the N graphs. If you're back there, folks, let me see. Oh, I'm sorry, slide number 3, my mistake. So let's take a look at this. N-grams are one of the things that our friendly engineers at our friends at Google invented. It's something you can actually use on Google, which is a lot of fun, and you can waste a lot of time with it. But it's one of the things we found out is that you've got everything that was ever printed in the world from 1800 to 2013. And you see what these periods of the world, what they look like and the way people describe things. Eastern Mediterranean's never had much of a pickup. We aim to change that today. But the Levant and the Near East, you'll see most people really did refer to the areas that we're talking about as the Eastern Mediterranean as the Near East or the Levant for a long period of time. But this neologism of the Middle East was first used right prior to World War I by the US and later British naval strategists, for whom the center of the Middle East, and now we'll go back to slide the slide with the map there, that we're looking at what was the Middle East. Boy, this is something you're never supposed to do, is walk into a room with these things on. I apologize. in any case, what you see here, it was the Middle East only in terms of where you were looking towards the gateways to India and trade with India. And how that could be, that was what was the Middle East, was how to get trade out of there and to convert the British fleet to oil and to secure those resources. So that was a definition that was driven by naval strategy in an oil-driven century. They designated the Middle East as the area between Arabia and India. Okay, the objective was to maintain the gateway to India in the east as the dominant priority of the emerging oil-based economy of the 20th century. The inflation of this idea, you'll see by these different definitions, continued after World War I, expanded in World War II to include Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, Turkestan, and the Caucasus. The U.S. Secretary of State at the time, John Foster Dulles, bloated the definition further, describing the East as, quote, the area lying between and including Libya from the west and Pakistan to the east, Syria and Iraq on the north, to the Arab Peninsula on the south, plus Sudan and Ethiopia. In 2004, the Bush administration met that bet and was able to swell the political definition and raised it even more broadly to include every country that had a Muslim majority. So this Eurocentric definition of the Middle East that comes from the early part of the 20th century has then exploded to deal with every population, every geography that has largely dark-skinned Caucasians. Not a very precise way to define a region. So, but way back into the future, and let's go to the map of what we're going to talk about today, which is number 4. Number 4. This area, which really does deserve the term called Eastern Mediterranean, because that's what it was called 3,000 years ago when the Phoenicians, a group of seagoing Canaanites, and then during the Iron Age and the Bronze Era, and then became the Israelites in the second millennium, emerged, and they were created what Fernand Braudel and David Abulafia, great historians, called the most vigorous place of interaction between different societies on the face of the planet. Basically, the Eastern Mediterranean was what gave us the cultural advantages of the late Bronze Age to Iron Age Greece and Italy through writing, education, and trade. And from that merging of the East and West that occurred within the Eastern Mediterranean, all of Mediterranean culture emerged, from which everything that we know and later the evolutions of our societies. So this is way back to the future in terms of what happened 3 millennium ago, and what is being reinvented as a term now to include those areas of what had been the non-oil producing Middle East, which I think we can put to bed as an obsolete terminology, and to try to disaggregate it and to understand this basin as what could be a potentially, as Senator Mary Landrieu has called, a major game changer in the geopolitics of the 21st century. So I'm going to first start with Senator Landrieu to ask her to sort of help us share with her vision of how she understands this region, and then we're going to do a deep dive into the details of it, both from the actual discoveries themselves, what they mean in terms of carbon, the transition to non-carbon economies, and the roles of a portfolio of different energy alternatives. That'll be the next panel that Mary is on in a few moments afterwards, and then talk about the geopolitical and the geofinancial and economic implications of this as well with our other very important guests. But
thank you, Glenn.
Senator Landrieu.
Well, thank you, Glenn, very much. I'm sure you're all now confused about why a senator from Louisiana would be here talking about this part of the world, and I'm going to explain that in just a minute. But let me begin by saying, since Glenn is from Louisiana, which I want all of you to know, from Shreveport, Louisiana, and he asked me to be on the panel, I like to be accommodating to my constituents, whether they're still voting there or not. So, Glenn, that is why I'm here, and of course to be with this distinguished group. I'm also the newly appointed chair for the Energy Committee in the United States Senate, Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and of course representing a state that I'm so proud, we are so proud from Louisiana and the Gulf Coast to be a really significant player in the production of oil and gas and fossil fuels and the new technologies that we're going to be talking about today. So those are several of the reasons. I'm going to just be really brief and give a general overview because the gentlemen on this panel know a lot more of the details than I do. But from a big picture perspective, let me just say that I was very proud to lead the first ever oil and gas delegation from the United States to Israel. And you all might be familiar with the old joke that, you know, Moses did a lot of wonderful things, but he made the wrong turn and didn't go, you know, the right way. And people laughed about that for years because Israel had no known reserves of a commodity that they really needed to strengthen themselves, et cetera. So when I read about Noble's finding in the Eastern Mediterranean, I was very intrigued by it because my whole life I had basically sort of grown up with the idea that oil in that particular part of the Mideast, or gas in that particular part of the huge Mideast that Glenn's just described, that it's really a very large part of the planet, but I'd never thought it would actually be true. So led a delegation in 11 and then a second delegation in 12 with 25 oil and gas companies from Louisiana and Texas, basically, to really see if it was real. And it is, it's real. Noble's going to tell you all about what they've been doing. But the game changer, and these are two of my favorite points of this, and I'll come back to the connection between the Gulf Coast and Israel, but two of my very favorite facts regarding this particular find is that the Eastern Mediterranean region's natural gas market continues to mature, and even without additional exploration, and the development of the region's reserves are enough to meet their current demand for 40 years. So from going to have no source of your own energy to having 40 years of your own, to transfer from oil that you got from neighbors that were not very friendly to, you know, gas of your own. The other interesting environmental impact, which Noble shares, but I'm going to steal it from them because I like it so much, I talk about it in Washington all the time, is that using natural gas from the company's Tamar field that went online just a year ago, offshore of Israel in 5,000 feet of water, the technology of which we developed in the Gulf of Mexico and in the North Sea, but Louisiana and Texas are particularly proud of the work that we did to develop deep sea drilling so it can be possible now in other places, is the equivalent of reducing CO2 emissions by approximately 195 million metric tons, the equivalent of taking every car off the street of Israel for 14 years. So the benefits economically to Israel and to its partners in the area, which are few but hopefully growing, its improvement to its economic bottom line and its environmental outlook is just, it's game-changing. And for the democracy in the Middle East to be able to control its own sources of energy and then partner with neighbors that have not always been so friendly, but hopefully that peace will continue to grow in partnership with Jordan, et cetera. And with the decline of the production in Syria, which is a whole other issue that I'm sure the panelists will talk with you about, I mean, this is a miracle, and it's a lot of hard work, but it's a wonderful thing that's happened. And for the U.S., for our country, with our relationship with Israel and the other partners in the region, that this is our main partner, we're excited about that as a game changer for this part of the world and for our politics. Now to Louisiana. We know a lot about fossil fuel development, about minimizing the environmental footprint. We've made a lot of mistakes, but we're making a lot of progress in how to get the resources from both onshore and offshore. We think that we can share a lot of expertise in America's energy coast along Texas and Louisiana and to some degree Mississippi and Alabama with Israel and its partners there, and develop, not only help them develop the skills and expertise they need in this particular field, but also that they can help with their extraordinary advanced technology for the new alternative technologies that can help merge America's energy coast with now this Mideastern, original, well, very ancient coast that now is really coming upon a resource that it didn't realize it had. So that's why I'm here. I'm happy to be a part of this. I've passed a piece of legislation with Ron Wyden and Lisa Murkowski to already establish, this partnership. Any of you that are interested, please come talk with me about it. But I am, very bullish on the future of natural gas in this world, minimizing our carbon footprint, maximizing the growth of economies and middle class and opportunities. And if we can get the infrastructure, which is a real issue, with pipelines and with liquefied natural gas facilities around the world, it could really be a remarkable opportunity for America and for our friends and allies around the world. So thank you, Glenn, very much.
Thank you very much, Senator. I think what we'd like to do now is to go from this basic sort of statement of defining terms, talking about the vision of how this could be transformative for the Eastern Mediterranean region and how that relates to Europe and other places. But let's talk about what it is we're talking about first. No one knows more about that than Lawson Freeman, who heads up as Vice President of the Eastern Mediterranean for Noble Energy. And if you would just go to an opening slide 22, gives you a brief summary, but he's going to speak and detail this so we understand the magnitude of the physical effort it requires to actually lift this resource and to turn it into the type of economic benefit it could become regionally.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. I appreciate being here and being part of this dialogue. And the first thing I wanted to say is to thank Senator Landrieu for what she just talked about, and just I don't want to go into a lot of details about the kind of support that's meant in Israel, but it's been very, very important because not only is it emphasized the need for a healthy industry there, which is very important, but it's actually setting an example for how to be a champion of an industry, and an industry there needs a champion, and so I appreciate that very much. Some of the concepts I'll talk about a little bit more, but it's actually things that sound very simple but are very important, and it's things like standards, development of operating requirements and standards that other people in other places in the world know about, like, for example, Louisiana. It sounds like a pretty simple concept. It's actually quite important, and it's one of the things to have that sort of support coming over from the States and to visit the platform has been very important to us, and I appreciate that very much. Just a little bit of the chronology here. We came into Israel in 1998, developed a small field, discovered a small field called Noah in 99, then discovered Mary B, which is a 1 TCF field that is now depleted. And that's what was that was the entirety of what flowed into Israel for quite a few years. We had a couple of dry holes along the way. We tested another couple of plays, Andromeda and Hannah, in 2001 and 3. We did our first IEC. IEC is Israel Electric Corporation, and we did our first contract with them in 2002, with first gas sales happening in 2004. So between 2004 and just about now was the entirety of the depletion of the Mary B field. It created the industry, and then what changed everything was in January of 2009 with the Tamar discovery. So Mary B was the only thing there. That was 1 TCF, and Tamar is a 10 TCF find. So a very big, game-changing discovery for us. And as Senator Landrieu mentioned, that's 20 years of supply with the numbers, the consumption that they had. We followed that right back up with a similar-looking play, Leviathan, which is now a 19 TCF discovery. We're in an appraisal stage on that. That's not online yet. It's something that we're working really hard to do. And because of the 20-year supply with Mary B, this became an export project. So the whole discussion about export and all of the debate about that got started with Leviathan. Then we followed that up. The Cyprus A discovery was in 11, with a few more finds smaller than the others in 12 and 13. So that's kind of the chronology of how we got to this place. So next slide, please. So just touch on Mary B. It's not really about Mary B, but just to kind of set the stage. If you look at IEC's consumption going from whenever Mary B first came online, what you're seeing there is power plant conversions. You're seeing electricity generation moving from coal and fuel oil over to natural gas. And Israel deserves a lot of credit for this. In the scheme of things, if you look at this over a number of years, that's a fast conversion. None of these natural gas lines that you see on here existed. So all of that happened pretty quickly, and that was a government and industry working together to make that happen and put that in place. And the benefits are astounding. I mean, these numbers that you see here are not the Tamar numbers that Senator Landrieu mentioned, but this is just for Mary B. And these are very, very accurate numbers because we have an actual comparison. This is what they burned versus what they could have done. So $7 billion in savings. And so, 10 times that you would expect with Tamar because of the size of the reserves. and 17 million metric tons of CO2 emissions, and that's simply the difference between the emissions of the fuel oil that they were burning versus the natural gas. And then we spent a lot of money in the last 3 years. The big race for us and a lot of the drama and the excitement about Tamar is Mary B was running out of gas, and we knew it. From a reservoir engineering standpoint, it was clear it was running out of gas. We had to get Tamar on and get it online. So if we were going to ask them to rely upon natural gas like this, we needed to be there with natural gas. And so it was a race for us. We spent a lot of money on Mary B, putting in compression and drilling extra wells, but at some point you can only pull on it so hard and get so much. So we felt like we did the responsible thing there by keeping that gas online, and we came in just in time with Tamar. So next slide, please. So this is the Tamar project. So the subsea development, the wells are in a mile deep of water, and we drilled 5 of these wells, 5 producing wells, and it's all subsea. There's not a platform on top of there. It's about 60 miles offshore Haifa.
You can't even see
And
it.
so it's all under the water. It's done with underwater robotics. You can see the manifold there in the middle where all the lines come in, and the yellow lines are umbilicals, how you control your wells from the platform. So the project as we describe it here was drill all those wells at that depth, install this subsea development there, 150 kilometers of dual 16-inch pipelines all the way up the shelf, and to us that's climbing the Rocky Mountains with that pipeline coming up onto the shelf in the scheme of things. Build and transport this extra platform. The one on the top there is the Tamar platform, and we teed it into the line that already existed that brings the gas on shore from Mary B, and commissioned all this and put it online, and successfully got started up just over a year ago, in March of 2013. So that's a $3 billion project, and that's what, when we say the Tamar project, that's the Tamar project. So next slide. So this is the main rig that we use, the Sedco Express, for the development, drilling, some of the exploration and development. That's by the time you have all your support, I'm trying to describe scope and scale a little bit. That's $1 million a day by the time you have your support vessels and all that for a rig like this. And they did a great job with our drilling program. So next slide. This is just a shot of, to show you how fast it all came together. This is what we call the main deck float. 4 decks on that production platform. There's 12 cranes there that you rent in a big yard near Corpus Christi. And whenever when you rent that for a month down the road, you better have all your stuff in. And we procured this stuff from all over the world, and so you can imagine it's pretty tense when you're rigged up for this day to put that deck on if there's some pieces you're waiting on. So kind of an exciting time for us. Next slide there. There's the jacket. That's the piece of the platform we call the jacket. That's 20,000 tons, and that's right at about the main part. That's in the same yard. You can't see the topsides there, but in the same yard, showing some progress on that. So next slide. This is some of the umbilical being wound onto the installation vessel, that yellow umbilical that we were talking about. This is how they install it and put it in. They make it on big spools in Mobile, Alabama, and then and then spool it onto this big installation vessel. Next slide. There's the installation vessel for the pipeline. That's the All-Sea Solitaire, the largest lay vessel in the world. And the significance of that picture there is when you look at Mary B there in the background, this is the start of the pipeline. So that's the view of Mary B from where Tamar would be. So whenever we were parked there with this vessel, we were looking over there and saying that's going to be the view of Mary B when we get Tamar installed someday. So next shot. That's the manifold going into the water, and that manifold's bigger than this room. And it's the place that all the lines come in together. And again, you put all these pieces together with underwater robotics. So it's NASA stuff. It's from an engineering standpoint, it is very cool stuff. Next shot. There's the platform as the topsides, as it's really starting to take in shape. And this was about in the summer. This was about June of 2012, right in there. And I think this was just before your trip out in the fall. So next slide there. Again, scope and scale, big steel pictures. This is the Harima H851. This is pulling past some stuff in Corpus Christi. They're going to go get this platform and transport it over to Israel. And it takes about a month and a half to make the journey and come over to Israel. So next slide. And there's the after putting it on, there's the jacket going on over there to make the big journey over, and you can imagine that you're watching the Weather Channel whenever that thing's making the trip. So next shot. There's the Topsides coming past that same hotel, whatever that is, on a little bit smaller vessel. But if it looks kind of top heavy, it's because it is. And again, you're watching the weather. And so next shot. I took this shot from on top of I keep saying the largest in the world. This is the largest lift vessel in the world, the Hermetioff. Two of the big cranes here, and that's the jacket about to go in the water on the day that we put it in. What happens is you float this jacket into the water, and it floats. You've got it compressed. You've got compressed air inside it. It floats, and then you use a lot of ballasting and pick it up with these great big cranes and set it into place and attach it to the ocean floor. The hydraulic hammers that you use to kind of drive the nails in the bottom of these great big yellow things that you see on the deck, those are the hydraulic hammers to get that installed. So next picture. And there it goes in the water. It's a big day for us, and we were watching this. I think I took this one too from the back of the lift vessel. And basically what you do is you sink the back of that barge, and you sink the back of it, and that thing flat when you overcome the frictional force of steel on steel, it goes when it wants to. So you have little bets of when it's going, as a bunch of engineers in a room, as you imagine. But that's it, just as it starts to go off into the water. And there's a lot of discussion on board of this thing is going to float, right? Kind of thing. So next slide. It is. It's laying on its side, and you put it in the water, and then with the ballasting, it rights itself, and you grab the top of it with that big crane. And so this is after it's setting up. Do you see how much of that's sticking up out of the water? That's after the platform, the jacket's been installed. And this is a big lift. That topside weighs 11,000 tons, and even for the tee-off, that's a big lift. And you set it down there and line it up just right and kind of hold your tongue just right and set it on top. And this is that process happening. It takes about a day to do that. Next. And there's a view of kind of an artistic view there of right at the end. That's after the tee-off. You can see the size of that vessel after it has set the topsides on there, and we're just getting it flanged up, and this is about December, ready to go. Next slide, please. There's a picture of there it is, the completed Tamar platform. Next. And that was a big day for us. March 31 of last year, that's these guys reacting to the blip on the meter of the first gas flowing and hitting the Israeli shore from there. So we had that day up on our boards for a long time, and this was a really big day for us. So next slide. And this is almost done here. This is the Leviathan Project. This is the next one. Remember, Leviathan is 19 TCF, and it's probably going to be done with a boat, an FPSO. It'll go to the domestic market via a northern landing point, and so create some redundancy there. It'll also be an export project, and we'll probably go to the neighbors, and we're talking to Egypt and talking to Turkey, talking to Cyprus, talking to Jordan. All of those are possibilities for pipelines, as well as LNG as a possibility as well. And so to us, that is the Leviathan Project. Again, it's a multi-billion-dollar project. It'll come in phases, and we'll be spending a lot of money. In its peak, we'll be spending $5 or $6 million a day for a long time on that project when we get started.
So this sort of sets it up very well for us, Lawson. I appreciate that. Okay. Let's just go back to slide. Let me come back to this one right at the end, because this is a subject I do want to ask you about. Okay. So we've got slide 40 again. Just think of that moment on March 31st. If you pull up slide 40. The implications of that, so what we just heard about was the 10 trillion TCF, on top of that a 19 trillion TCF. According, and again, all with many grains of salt, the US Geological Survey in 2010 says that in the whole region of this Eastern Mediterranean, we could be talking both up to 122 trillion cubic TCF. So a huge amount, multiple of this, which would redefine, along with many other things going on in terms of other forms of energy, other portfolio energy products that follow on from gas as we transition into many new technologies over the next half a century. It would really transform what was originally called the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, which everybody was, where the oil monopoly existed for 100 years, to a much more diverse energy platform. And just the mentioning here, when that gas started to flow, first domestically to Israel, but then the first oil gas export is to Jordan, I understand, at $500 million to Jordan Potash. Was that one was signed, or read about that one? And then
Yes.
$1.2 billion transaction with the Palestinian Electrical Corporation. This is a little bit behind the headline risk you normally read about, right? Of transactions that are going on. And a European market that is, we know from the news here, that has nothing to do with the Mediterranean at all, but a lot to do with the Black Sea and the Ukraine. A European market that's desperately needed of energy diversification, with the possibility of the first pipelines to Turkey in 2015, or subsea pipelines to other areas, or the idea that even this very expensive proposition of how LPG would be transmitted, or liquid natural gas would be transmitted for Asian exports, that might actually could take place in Egypt. So if you're not confused by this picture, it means you hadn't understood it yet, which is most of us. There's so many things here that are contradictory to our categorical understandings of what has been the Middle East that aren't true in the Eastern Mediterranean. And with that, to go back to a deeply Eastern Mediterranean country, the state of Israel, where Ron Prosser comes from and is our ambassador to the United Nations. What do you think the geopolitical implications could be of this redefinition?
First, Glenn, I have to tell you, when I just saw Lawson show all those slides, it's absolutely inspirational.
It is.
And we have, to zoom back and say, look, Noble Energy came into the area where no one wanted to come in. And we should not forget that when we move forward and try, and learn things. Because if Shimon Peres, our president, would be here, he'd probably say, Glenn, in the Middle East there are holy states and oily states. We definitely don't fall under the category of an oily state. But today we're a gassy state. So in the sense, the senator mentioned the issue of Moses. Look, we are just after Passover, and it seemed to us that he really passed over every oil reserve that he could, miss. And I think this is absolutely amazing for the state of Israel, first and foremost, because of the whole idea of energy independence. But beyond that, it's the whole regional aspect which comes from a different angle, and for the first time from an angle where Israel holds the wheel. Hence, when we do something with Egypt, we hold the wheel. We are not subjected to a pipeline which someone decides to close for some reason or the other because of political implications. When we try and do things both on the Palestinian side, on the Jordanian side, on the Turkish side, and the Greek side and the Cyprus that connects it to Europe, it puts Israel in a completely different regional prospect with also things that are relevant for our infrastructure. Because through that, and as you know, we have a good learning curve. We're in a learning curve now. And in the infrastructure side, we have to do a lot of stuff. And we can begin by serious infrastructure and then see the financial infrastructure, hence the infrastructure that deals with regulation, the infrastructure that regulation part, is of course problematic for Noble Energy and others because we're in the first stages of basically coming into a field that we had no expertise in. But as you know, what that independence allows us also to create what we would call the sovereign fund, not just for education, not just for infrastructure, but creating the base from which Israel can really jumpstart and become, a completely different stage. And I really believe that, we've begun doing that, and Noble began doing that by having Israeli engineers begin to really study something that up till now we had no clue. And as you know, this is all because of the Jewish mother. She is, the sound reason behind the entrepreneurial spirit in Israel. You know, every Jewish mother really feels that their children are absolute geniuses. The world just hasn't recognized it yet. So if you fail, it's okay, you know, try again, you know. The world will recognize that. So I hope also in that field, with the industrial base, with the technological base, we will find ourselves in a different place. The last thing that I want to say is that it also creates huge challenges for Israel in the way we deal with this. Because this is going to, like I said, present to us something that brings in through exports huge money, and it's the way we basically handle this ourselves internally in Israel and build it in a way that is wide enough for most parts of the population to really enjoy. So in summing this up, I think this is an amazing thing. I hope, Lawson, that you guys dig deeper so we'll find some more oil, not just gas. And really for us, this is, I think, one of the most really inspirational, and we're looking forward to really moving forward in this. Thank you.
Ambassador Proster's brought up a couple of points that we've discussed here at the conference. It was 2 years ago, we had one of our Financial Innovations Lab with the Bank of Israel and our colleagues from the Ministry of Finance and the National Economic Council to build the Sovereign Wealth Fund based on these additional gas revenues that projected over the next 15 years to become up to 5% of GDP. Israel moves into being a creditor nation, engages with knowledge-based exports and perhaps other energy products or downstream energy products with other partners in the region that could be significant. But today, pull up slide 21, the implications of this, the advantages in terms of having deeper desalination, cheaper desalination and deeper and more affordable electricity production. Anybody who's here from Egypt will remember what the blackouts were doing in terms of causing political instability. There's only about 8 hours a day of electricity if you're in Jordan or if you're in Jericho. So the inconsistency of electrical production and having power generation where there's more domestic power, fewer shortages, fewer blackouts, fewer fuel shortages. The ideas of economic development that can derive potentially from gas and electrical supply, and the health issues that Senator Landrieu brought up earlier, but clearly the issue of water, which is so tremendously scarce. Israel currently has excess water production because of cheaper desalination and has water exports. But what do these things all mean, Mehmet Sedam, who comes to us from Istanbul and London, in terms of looking at the natural resource markets and the implications of how these change the geofinancial and economic dimensions?
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. The enthusiasm and the motivation has been so great that now I feel obliged to put a little bit of a perspective and into all this. Yes, everything is great, it's fantastic, this is absolutely a game changer, etc. But then we have to a little bit understand and put things into perspective. That's what I would like to do first, and then try to understand what are the major problems into really turning what today could effectively be something that deserves so much enthusiasm, and potentially one or two solutions to that. Putting things into perspective, the US Geological Survey, and as you rightfully mentioned, all these numbers first are new for most of us, like trillion TCF you said, but the T in the TCF is already trillion. Mm-hmm. So, and some people will talk about metric and etc., and you will forgive my Europeanism, and I will give some numbers into metric. What the US Geological Survey says about the Levant in the whole region, so it's not only that part, but the whole Levant region to have, is 3.2 TCM, so a trillion cubic meters, which is 1 to 35, the ratio between TCM and TCF. The US consumes every year 0.7 TCM. The world reserve is 1.8 thousand TCM. So the Levant region, in the global scales of things, and energy is a global play. Right. And the only thing that remains in between the full fluent spread of the energy is politics. That's the only thing that remains, and cost of transportation. That's pretty much the only two things that makes that in fact, some people regionally, like Israel to start with, would actually require to have oil or energy, is because of those two things that will stop energy flow. US's gas today cost is approximately $3.7 to $4. That Leviathan project that is starting is going to be $2.7. Turkey's purchase price from the region, from Russia, is $14.5. But the LNG that will be produced, and Noah will obviously be much better placed to explain, will actually cost $14 to produce. So in a way, the point I'm trying to make is that the entire point is what the cost that you produce at and what's the cost that you transport it at. And if you did not have those political problems in between countries, then the fluidity will be such that in fact one country would not actually need to produce. And I come back, another way to stress that point is that 1.8, the 180, I said 180 TCM is the world reserve. So what the US Geological Survey expects this region to produce is about like 2% of the world reserves. So it's not a macro element that is happening. It's a regional, we all realize. But when you look at the region, you know how much gas is there in the region? Russia, Iran, Turkmenistan, and Qatar. How much do they have? 130. So a very big, vast majority of the reserves is in that region. You have 33 TCM in Russia and Iran. You got 25 in Qatar, 17 in Turkmenistan. And despite that, Turkey had, up until recently, one of the world's most expensive energy. So the fact of having that proximity to energy is not necessarily a direct result, does not directly result into you having a fantastic world economy. So the fact that the first thing I want to say is that we have to put things into perspective, and sorry to be the party spoiler, that the regional energy that is discovered in the greater scales of things, and once again, if the politics were not an issue, is not so major. The second, but it's important for the region. I can come back to you to that. Now I've got a little bit of a thought in my mind, and if you allow me to continue because otherwise I'm going to be entirely lost, but I'll come back to you on that. Which is decreasing, by the way. They have a North Sea as a gas reserve for the next 12 to 15 years. And in 2020, Norway, which is one of the major gas supplier of Europe, is expected to dry out. Now I've lost my track. No, so Turkey as a major consumer in the local region. Oh yeah, now I remember. There was a joke. Yes, regionally is not the most important thing. Globally is not the most important thing, but regionally is important. And again, forgive my Europeanism for making an analogy which is not politically correct, but they say that energy is like sex. It's when you have it regular enough, then it's not the world's most important thing. So for the region, in Israel to start with, but not only, to have it, and that will probably be what's the game changer will happen, is that finally we will stop by having energy to be the most important thing. But so I was saying at the beginning that energy is a global play. The US is producing an extremely cheap gas that will start to export, which will impact the European market, will come into the European market, which forces Russia to consider its exports linked to oil prices, which US's gas is not linked to gas, is linked to gas, but Russian's gas is linked to oil, which meant that the prices in the gas prices increase in Russia was so dramatic, which led then to Europe and others to use alternatives like the Southern Gas Corridor, which with a very small move, Russia not linking anymore gas prices to oil would actually automatically make it completely caduc and uneconomical. In that example, again, one of the point that I'm trying to make, all these discussions that is evolving today with Russia, Europe, Ukraine, the gas routes to Nabucco, that doesn't happen, the Tama that replaced it, the southern and the northern streams, and et cetera. In fact, a very little economical thing could change, could have a huge impact, much greater, in fact, than finding gas locally. But yet again, in between, another very striking element is, and that will link to the issue of how it's not only the economic that stops the fluidity of gas, but it's also the politics. Look at the Levant region. So 3 TCM is a lot. And turning from a net importer to a net exporter is amazing. But that's not only for Israel or the Republic of Cyprus. Lebanon also has it. Syria also has it. Turkey allegedly has it in all the region. But yet again, none of these regions, Turkey included, actually manage to turn that hypothesis into gas. And the only reason is, in fact, is that the guys like Noble, when they go somewhere and throw all of these very complicated challenges, which in fact means money, in a very long term, what they need is stability.
Right.
And I just want to make one reference to Turkey as a part of a solution. I fear that, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, that probably was the case. And I don't want to get into the very detailed and another subject for another discussion. But today, we ourselves have looked at one energy issue and investments and financing and etc., where in fact finally it will hit the pipeline in Turkey. Whereas 10, 15 years ago, that oil hitting the Turkish pipeline would have been for you a safe haven. Now we start to wonder whether or not how safe that is, and whether or not, in fact, that's not our sorry and worry is not actually finished. We have other worries that could come up on top of it. So I think the fact that all of these regions have not yet had nobles of this world coming in and throwing so much money into those investments is precisely that they have the political stability was not there. I can't go on for hours, so you have to stop me. But
well, I think you raised, I want to go back to slide 42 because this is another dimension that Lawson wanted to speak to about how we try to understand the risk for the investor and for the producer. But I think you've raised a number, what I heard there were some very important points. Put this in perspective. It's a modest fine. It's a tremendous fine for somebody who never had it before. I like your great analogy. We'll have to remember that joke. But the dimensions of risk have to be specified, and I think you tried to do it here in this slide. Would you just tell us how you see this as being related to our discussion today?
Sure. We talk about this quite a bit because, as you say, it's very early days, and even though it doesn't seem like it does, we've been there for a while. But for the industry in Israel and in Cyprus, it's very early days, and there aren't a lot of regulations, and they're developing their framework as we go. And so we talk a lot about this need for stability and about how critical it is for investments in these big multi-year, multi-billion-dollar projects. And the way we talk about it in terms of risks is we say, look, we say it's very simple. This is not emotional. It's not. It's just very clinical. There's operational risks that we have, and from a cost and schedule standpoint, your investments and your costs, things could affect that and cause it to be different than you thought it would in your economic model. On the revenue side, it's a couple of things. Everything that influences revenue is important, and you can have a great big reservoir, and you could think that you can drill 5 wells and drain that reservoir, and you find out it's all fractured up, and it takes 50 wells at $100 million apiece. And so can you be wrong on these things? Absolutely you can, and there are risks associated with those. But what we say is that's what we manage for a living. That's our message on that, is that we've got 80 years in the industry doing this, a lot of experience in major producing basins, and a bunch of gray-haired guys like me with 30 years in this thing. That's what we do, and that's what we take on. We don't ask for any help in that, but our message is don't move the foundation on us, and the foundation is that fiscal regime. It's things like operating and design requirements and what we're expected to build to and operate to, stability in that, and of course contract sanctity and all the things that you hear an oil and gas company say that's important. So we just say, that's what we don't control, and that's what investors are nervous about. So we need some stability in that one.
Senator Landrieu.
Well, I just want to add, I really appreciate the broad views of this panel, and particularly our last speaker. But when these slides were up here showing the infrastructure that's built, I just cannot tell you how proud I am as a senator from Louisiana, because we build a lot of it in our state, and we are proud of it. You don't hear this much coming from Washington, so I want you to hear it from me. We believe that this industry is extraordinary. Both our major international operators, our independent operators, and our small mom and pop companies in America that just do it the old-fashioned way. They just roll up their sleeves, they take risk, nobody's throwing money at anybody. They are investing very carefully the money they have, managing enormous risk, both physical risk, political risk, and everything else. As a leader, I would just say that the prize will go to countries that have stability in their politics, where companies can work and know their assets won't be taken over, where they can produce a product at a reasonable cost, and like Israel right now is trying to understand how to trust Noble so that they can make the money they need to make to return to their investors. Israel and its people and its region can benefit. And I can just say that with the new technologies that are out there, the possibility of the United States and North America to become an energy giant in exports with Canada and Mexico, and it may not be the most important volume to the world, but for Israel and the politics of that part of the world, it is a phenomenal game changer and a wealth creator and a builder of opportunity. So, I don't know what's going to happen in the other parts of the Mideast, or, I'm not real happy about what Putin's doing to use his resource to force politics that's really against the interest of the planet. So I really want the U.S. to be as strong as we can be on energy, with Israel, our partner, and any other European partners and other NATO partners that want to join us in producing the kind of energy that keeps our country strong, vibrant, and able to promote our democratic values around the world. And I just don't think we should be shy about it. And Louisiana and Texas, I can tell you, are really proud of what we do.
So we've got a situation of where there are aspects of what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean can join rather than divide, which is what we've usually seen happen with energy in the Middle East. So if that possibility is realized, let's just take one or two final questions. Yes, right over here.
Hi, Jonathan Berman from Dahlberg. First of all, I want to compliment Lawson for having skills as a photographer that matches skills as a commercial petroleum engineer. Those are fantastic photos.
Thanks.
But I actually wanted to ask you a commercial and regulatory question. Okay. The development timeline on the pipelines in particular and the project as a whole seem well ahead of industry standard. And I wonder if Israel's approach to local content or technology transfer, if you could just talk to that a little bit and whether that had some role in the speed, in the pace of that development. Thanks very much.
Let's just take two questions once, and then because we're going to have to wrap up. Any other question? One back there.
Michael Sterling from Sterling Capital Partners. My question is to Noble on Mehmet's points. Clearly you would know those risks before you entered, and what would your response be?
Anybody else? Okay, we'll wrap it up with just those questions, I guess.
Okay, sure. On the local content, local capability question, I wouldn't say that it had a really big role in the development of Tamar. It'll have a much bigger role going forward. And there's a lot of discussion, a lot of very healthy discussion about going forward. How do we develop, how do we work together to develop and grow that local capability? And it's not just people, it's industry. I mean, we'd like to see a world where there's more and more capability there in Israel where you're partnering up with the universities and things there that you're developing that over time, where you're talking about using people, and you are also in places that it makes sense that you're developing those industries. But we also are we're very big proponents in doing that responsibly, that none of those things happen overnight, and they have to be very thoughtful in the way that we do it. We've actually got a very good discussion going on with that, and so we've stated that intent, and obviously it's in Israel's interest to do the same thing, and so that's their desire as well. And
Any,
then
any final
May I
comments
just,
from our other-
as to the political risk element, I just want to give one fact about Israel. When the interministerial, the Tzemach committee, was it, made a proposition, a report, in saying that out of the 1.5 or 1.9 TCM of reserves, the committee said we should export only 500. So Israel should export only 500. Whereas, of course, that would have been against the interest of Noble. For the local domestic price will be much less than the export price, especially when the right next door Turkey is paying such a high price. But what Israel agreed to is, in fact, only to keep 540. So that's, I think, is an element, important element as to what the countries in the region have to accomplish to see people like Noble or others to come and invest.
Last word to Ambassador Prosser.
No, the last word is that I hope that in addition to Noble, we'll have, I see Woodside and other operational companies come in order for that to be divided, and again, to expand that amazing potential which is there. And again, to say thank you to Noble for really being the first ones out, and for really pushing this forward and having a lot of patience to bear some of the problems in Israel's bureaucracy and dealing with this for the first time.
Thank you all.
Thank you.